Hello and welcome to our DMB live session. Today we talk about Soundscape and object-based mixing and ideas behind it. My name is Ralf Zuleeg. I'm running the Soundscape enablement team here at DMB. And my partner for today will be Dom Bilkey. He is the head of sound of the National Theatre in London, and he's also working as a freelance sound engineer. And I have to be honest, I have seen one of his shows, and this was just mind-blowing. So I believe, talking to Dom, you will get a couple of really good insights of, what Soundscape is, what object-based mixing is, and ideas and the philosophy behind it. Dom, may I call you in?
Yep, certainly. Hi, Ralph. Hi, everyone. So my name's Dom Bilkey. I'm head of sound and video at the National Theatre in London. And as Ralph says, freelance sound designer, sound engineer as well. And I feel like long-time Soundscape user and stalwart now. It feels like we've been engaged in this relationship for a long time.
Absolutely, Dom. And just what I said in the beginning, and I think this would be a good entry as well. I have seen the Lehman show, where you have done your sound design in London. And I have to say, I'm German, and this is not my mother tongue. Watching a theater play in English, I was just nailed to my seat for 3.5 hours, and I was blown away. And I have to say, thank you very much for the honor to be able to watch this show. And for me, it would be interesting, how did you get to the idea of object-based mixing? I mean, we did for years right now. We talked about, left and right and what have you. And all of a sudden we have this, now it's not brand new anymore, but we have this idea, of looking at sound differently.
Yeah, I mean, the Lehman Trilogy actually is an interesting show. So in the original concept of the show that was brought to us here at the National, actually, with Nick Powell, who's a co-sound designer, I should mention at this point as well, and also a composer on the project, who worked extensively with on it. The kind of original design concept that presented itself to us was a glass rotating cube with with big glass walls on the stage. And of course, the initial observations of this looking, I can't remember how many years ago now it was probably 4 or 5 years ago, the first time we kind of had the concept of Lehman. And you suddenly look at this thing and you go, well, it's for anyone that hasn't seen it, and there's probably lots of you that haven't, it's a very narrative place. There's 3 performers in this glass box who tell the story of the Lehman Brothers arriving into New York, and the history of that company up until the collapse of it in 2008. And it's a very narrative play. There are 3 of them, and they take on a multitude of characters over a multitude of period of history. So the relationship with language is extremely important in that performance, and how the storytelling relates. So to see this original concept of Es Devlin, the set designer's glass cube, which is so striking, and as some of seen from the photos in the lead into us going live, it's such a striking image. But immediately the presentation was going, well, if it's narrative, how do we geographically consider text in that show? Because it's so important, this dialogue. And it's that kind of age-old discussion of a beautiful conceptual design, but how do you then marry that with the ability to the narrative? Because, fundamentally, theatre is about storytelling, and we can have beautiful images on stage, but we need that narrative storytelling. And so many ideas started to develop, if you like, as to how to achieve that. And I have to confess, in the original version of Lehman in the Littleton Theatre, the original version actually wasn't Soundscape, but it was a very crude approximation of what Soundscape does, bearing in mind the kind of time frame, if you like, of when we were talking about in the inception of the show. And we achieved that early rendition with it was D&B T series, and we had 3 arrays over the center, left, center, right of the box, and with a mixture of panning and delay and lots of programming, and a very, very capable team around us, achieved that version. Now, the only reason that version worked in the Littleton Theatre here at the National is that all of the seats had the ability to see the 3 arrays. So it was a very simple relationship between sound, and it didn't get, there were things it didn't do. Yes, we could go left and right across the stage with panning. We had a delay zone upstage, but it was quite crude in its, in how the relationship with sound developed. And it was obviously successful because the play went on and has gone on into further iterations. But it was something where, and we were at that point, I had been fortunate enough to witness an early, what's the word? I'd say beta is probably not the word, but I was lucky enough to have been
you call it alpha version.
And so I was aware of this concept and this product that had been developed, but it was a bit too early on where we were at. So we did the show anyway, and we kind of parked it and went, well, that was great, and it kind of worked. And the next announcement we had was that we were taking this show, which is all about narrative and all about storytelling in a revolving glass cube, to the Armory in New York. And immediately I went, so the Armory is, it's an absolutely massive venue in New York. It's the size of an entire block, to give you some idea.
Okay.
And it's got an extremely long reverberation time. It's a big domed ceiling all the way down. All the things that you go, narrative story, 3 people in a glass box. Eek.
You don't want you want to go home right now, when you enter the hall. I know that,
Yeah, exactly. And it was like, and there was a crazy decision made, and that was that we were going to transfer Lehman onto Soundscape for the first time in New York, because I, having witnessed it, played around with it, genuinely believed that what it offered was the refined version of spatial based placement of the objects, in this case the 3 performers, on a scale of the Armory. And so suddenly we've gone from the Lyttelton Theatre is an 800-seat theatre, behaves like a theatre, the acoustics are relatively well behaved, to the Armory, which is not acoustically well behaved. It's a very large, I mean, so large. Like I say, it's the size of an entire block. And so suddenly trying to get this relationship of narrative and giving people on the back of a kind of a stadium style seating bank, this experience, the same experience that we were giving people in the 800-seat theatre. And suddenly this idea of how we did this with Soundscape, and there was lots of questions, lots of people raising eyebrows going, because we ended up with, I think it was 40 Y series for a vocal. Which, yeah, exactly. And part of that was about control, back to fundamental physics of frequency control and pattern control in a very large reverberant space. But actually what it enabled us to do, we went in, so a long story short, put in the Soundscape and worked with the great support guys, Adam Hockley at D&B, who kind of came out, and we worked together on it. And put together this thing, and we sat there in the first timing session, and we put an object on the stage in the box, and suddenly went, oh. And it was just this amazing, moment where you suddenly realize that we could, and don't get me wrong, it was far from perfect in that initial moment, but it gave us the ability suddenly to go, the people at the back of this massive seating bank are going to have an intimate relationship with sound in a way that a PA left center, right, even with good delay, you don't achieve. You're exciting the room with, that kind of object of the microphone through all of the PA or parts of the PA. And suddenly in Soundscape, because it's so controlled, because of the delay and all the other relationships, it just gave us the ability to kind of locate it back in. I think we've got a visual of the glass box, actually. It's probably worth showing everyone from, there we are. So that's the Armory. You can get an idea of the scale. So yeah, I mean, it was massive. Even bigger than I'd imagined. And walking into the venue for the first time, I have to confess, my heart was, up in my mouth, and I was going, what have we done? What are we doing? But it worked. I mean, even to the point, so we set the show up, and learnt a lot very quickly. And we got to a point, and this was the great moment where we realized we were onto something, is the New York Times came in and did an interview in the space with Sam Mendes, the director. And we were doing some testing. We had a multi-track recording of the performers from London that we were utilizing to look at how the objects behaved in the space before the actors were on stage. And there was a great quote that made itself into the New York Times, which was about walking into the room and having the actors walk around the room even though they weren't there.
Cool.
And this reporter that had not been prepped at all of what we were doing. We were just doing our pre-system checks and tuning and trying to work out, this relationship. And the reporter just went, the ghostly voices of these actors walking around the stage when they're not there. And it was this moment where we went, this is something special.
Absolutely. I can just underline this experience that you just explained, that even in reverberant spaces, you go in there and you have, this multiple loudspeaker sources, and you have the object distributed in the room. So nothing arrives at the listener at the same time. So it's coming in here bits and pieces. So the energy that you put in is fragmented. And I remember, I worked with Kraftwerk with my very first alpha version in the Tate Modern, in the Turbine Hall.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly the same space. You want to leave immediately. And we rigged the system, and it was like this feeling of being immersed by sound, and the room was just faded away. It was not there anymore. It's an interesting experience. Dom, maybe a little bit about your philosophy when you start working on a system design for a theater play or for a musical. If I'm doing something like that, I usually have a picture in my head, and then I try to to find the bits and pieces that I need to realize that. what is your take on that? If you're now confronted, you have to do that show. How do you approach that when you're doing a system design or a sound system design?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think for me, I've always been, even before my engagement in Soundscape, I've always been one of those people that pictures sound in a 3D space. My brain just seems to work in that way. So I've always considered kind of delay, if you like, and how interaction of different loudspeaker sources in the room. It's not necessarily about coverage in the traditional sense of going everybody's covered by a speaker, that's fine. So even pre-Soundscape, I kind of like to approach that idea of going depth and field and how things come together. So in terms of like shows like Lehman and stuff, it's suddenly you start to look at it in, it's a really bizarre thing. And somebody, I can't remember who I was describing it to once, he said, well, when you're looking at that system and how it goes together and how the dots interact, and it's going to sound really cliche, but it's that kind of thing. It's almost like the Matrix where but you look at a stage and you look at it's that thing when you walk into a space for the first time, because you get a 3D graphic or even some photos sometimes, and you look at it and you suddenly start to build up this picture of how all of these different component parts of a system start to interact with the audience. And I think for me, the change as we moved into Soundscape is actually I'm picturing that on both sides of the pros. So in traditionally, you'd start to picture it about loudspeakers and cabinets and coverage and level in the auditorium. Now I also start to see how those relationships between those boxes would interact with objects that are moving within their sphere. So it is a bit, it sounds really cliche, a bit like the Matrix.
But it's absolutely fine.
But it is that it's, I guess I'm very, so talking about Soundscape, but very visual in that kind of how the interaction of systems coming out. And it's that, for me, what's become very interesting actually is people go, within Soundscape particularly, going, surely you need lots more boxes. And actually what's become really interesting about it is it's not always the case, because actually what you're doing is utilizing the rig in a different way to what you might have done previously. So you're providing a different way of covering that auditorium, where actually suddenly overlaps are encouraged rather than discouraged. You're going, well, actually it's still the same amount of boxes in a number of those scenarios. It's just that they're wider boxes, which are providing the overlap for the movement across, rather than definitely going, don't make them overlap, because that's not what we want to do. It's quite interesting how you approach. I mean, and the interesting thing, I mean, going back to Lehman or Death of a Salesman, which was in the Piccadilly with the system, the Armory was a very big scale, and actually kind of lent itself to that big hangs across the front, and everyone's like, well, what's going through it? And you're like, well, 3 vocal mics and a piano and some playback. And you look at it and I'm there going, this is ridiculous. But it's about pattern control in that space with the larger boxes. In the Piccadilly, it's suddenly about, so the Piccadilly, it is a Matcham style theatre, and it's got very deep balconies. And so suddenly your system design, you have that ability to weave, if you like, multiple delay lines into those cross points in terms of your system design. So rather than providing coverage to the back to make sure that everyone can hear, suddenly you're designing a system that enables you to get coverage to the back so everyone can hear, but also they can suddenly start to create the same images or similar images to the people that are sat at the front. So the system design philosophy, if you like, is evolving, but it isn't necessarily throwing away what we've already done, but it's what it can deliver. I mean, the Death of a Salesman in the Piccadilly was interesting, because you suddenly went back to the back of the circle, and as the performers moved around the stage, even at the back and the right up at the gods, I can't state how far back in that theatre you are, you felt like the actor was naturally talking and they were just in front of you. and then you mute the system and you realize actually how loud the system is and how much work it's doing. But it's that intimate relationship in system design where you suddenly go, it's not a speaker above me that's relaying a voice to the back of the gods. It's a relationship that I'm maintaining with a performer. And interesting, you get to the point, I remember a joking conversation with the producer, although, was it joke, is, oh, we can charge more for these seats now. The relationship with the actors up here actually is much better than it used to be. And you go, yeah, well, actually, that's a really interesting point.
It's absolutely interesting what you're saying, and if you're talking about coverage and what we have done before with channel-based system, when I'm talking here in the company and you have to keep that secret, we are the friends of incoherence, because all of a sudden we throw, the basic rules overboard. And what you just said, we have speaker overlapping, and if you think about it, you'd be creating tons of account filters. But the average in the end is delivering exactly that what you need, what you want to hear. And it is, for me, it's kind of interesting thing what you're saying. You visualize the room, and then you just think, what the actors are doing, and this has to be translated into the room. Have you ever thought about using smaller loudspeakers? If you go back to the Armory, would you reduce the amount of loudspeakers? Would you be that brave?
Ooh, do you know, in the Armory, I don't know whether I would in the Armory. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think what for me still holds true, and particularly in terms of the sound playback element and the piano as well. So I should iterate, actually, there's 3 characters in Lehman, but there's also a piano, which is the 4th character, absolutely, and underscores completely the 3 hours of the performance. I think for me, actually, by having the thing with the kind of size of the arrays actually in that job is those fundamental physics of directionality as a result, as a product of the size of the driver actually in the Armory example. But in terms of SPL, in terms of coverage, yes, absolutely, it could be a smaller box. It's just, would I be brave to go smaller? That's a good question.
The question always comes up when I'm touring, with my friends here from Düsseldorf, this old German band, and Serge, the sound engineer, asked always for huge KSL arrays. I said, no, fuck, we don't need that. Make it smaller. Why? Something small would do it. Less obtrusive. And it is then, for me, the idea that all of a sudden it is more about what's happening on stage rather than technology. Interesting what you have done in the Lehman with all the in what theater was it in London? The Lehman, the Piccadilly. I had the possibility to move, from different stories, because we were plenty and we had different seats, and it was an interesting experience in a way that no matter where you sat, it didn't sound similar, but it was always the actor. It was always the actor, and all of a sudden, I think also here, some fundamentals are going to change. It doesn't have to be exactly the same everywhere. It has to be the focus onto what's happening on stage. Have you got any quotes from the actors, from the system, how they felt on stage?
It's really interesting actually with the actors. So when we first in the Armory, actually, it was I think it was Simon Russell Beale was on stage, and his relationship was that he didn't feel, he was expecting it from a previous experience that it would be quite mic'd. And and you've got that kind of the reverberant reflections and feel from the auditorium coming back at you.
Yeah.
And he was like, actually, are they on? Because actually it's so controlled that actually the actors' relationship is they're not being bombarded by the reflections coming back from the auditorium onto the stage. And I think the same is true in the Piccadilly. It's because of the way in which the system works and the relationship with the narrative is the actor can actually articulate in a much more intimate way, actually. And again, they need to project, because obviously, you know, what we get into the microphone, we get out through the, you know, that relationship doesn't change in this at all. We still need, but what it does allow for is an intimacy with the actor, where they can pull that in slightly, and it's carrying to the back in a way that's natural. So it doesn't, like, the actor doesn't suddenly pull back slightly and suddenly the sound goes up into the system, which is, you know, even with a well delayed system, there's a fundamental, that relationship with level, where, you know, the actor pulls back, the operator pushes forward, and suddenly you go, there's the sound system. And with Soundscape, it doesn't. As they pull back and you push forward, but it naturally, that relationship's like a little an ebb and flow between the sound operator and the performer. And it's almost like a battle. I mean, Vicky, that operated it in London, and I hope she doesn't mind me for saying this, in previews, we found that Vicky intended to want to mix louder, and we were constantly pulling her back, but she was like, but they're not amplified. And you're like, and we did a series of exercises of muting the system, so it was a dead stop, and it would just disappear up onto the stage. And she was like, okay, you know, it's working really hard, but it's that natural wanton of how we've experienced sound systems in the past, which is, you know, there might be a distortion, probably not so much, but that kind of characteristic of sound coming forward. And when the system doesn't do that, you kind of go, oh, it's not quite working hard enough. And it was really interesting. And we got to a point where, like, we did an experiment in the afternoon, and the vocal level that we were achieving, we were sat in the middle going, this is far, far too loud, but just for this demonstration, but it was still keyed in. And as you say, it's that relationship of, in terms of each level was different. It's that kind of working with the kind of psychoacoustic effect of going, if I'm in the back of the gods and it's geographically located, but it's as loud as it would be if I was stood next to him, that starts to confuse me as an audience member. So naturally, just allowing that level as we go further away to maintain the absolute position, all of the other things, the clarity, but just backing the system down as we moved away up the layers, so that you had a bit, so that the aural experience matched the visual experience that we were still experiencing, which was being a long way away from the stage, very high up. So it was, yeah, very fascinating. But yeah, the actors, like I say, the biggest thing was that they don't suddenly feel that the PA is coming back at them in a way that, you know, if you reinforce to a certain level, it kind of, and they can feel the opera. I think the interesting thing is, in that bit where they pull back and the operator pushes forward in a traditional system, they suddenly become aware of the mic in the room.
Yep.
Whereas with Soundscape, actually, that's not the case. As the actor pulls back and the operator pushes, it just, that natural relationship. So it's an ebb and a flow, but it is like a little ballet between the operator and the performer. It's quite, and it's a weird thing about theatre, where people, I think, theatre is an interesting product in itself, and sometimes the amount of thinking that goes into hiding something is actually a lot more than doing the obvious big splashy thing. And I think theatre is one of those great things where sometimes the articulation in detail, nobody knows you've done it apart from you, but actually the product speaks for itself in the process. But it's theatre, you know, it's not musicals or bands in that way, which is kind of, oh yeah, I get. And like, particularly in the Armory, looking at the big arrays, everyone was like, oh, is it a really loud show? And you're like, not particularly, no, it's
It's interesting. Well, you know, I once got, you know, from Georg Sturmer, who is our product manager for Soundscape. He just put it once like that. He said, object-based mixing is providing the feeling of, you know, being close. Because, you know, the natural thing when you're going out on the street, this is not everything coming from one spot. Cars are all around you, you know, and this is what you're used to here. And if you're thinking about a channel-based system where you have put everything, you know, on this bus into one speaker, this is, you know, the feeling of distance. Because this is what you would experience, you know, if the theater play would be, you know, 300 meters away. And the interesting thing is for our experiences, to achieve a similar kind of emotion, you have to crank up the channel-based system much more than you would have to do with an object-based system, because you have already this immersive feeling, this suspension of disbelief. I love that. Is you don't recognize that they are speakers. It is natural. It is what you expect. This is what you have learned since you were born, and this is what you reproduce. And it's really, I was just so amazed in the Piccadilly Theatre. It sounded different, but it was always the actor. And I think, this was just for me the most stunning thing I've experienced. I will tell my daughter. This was the finest play I've ever seen. If we go in a little bit away from, do you do musical shows as well?
I've done a couple of musical based. I did one highly musical based play, Peter Pan, which I'm trying to think now, with COVID in the way, 3 years ago in a large kind of venue in West London. And again, so that was kind of more musical theatre. Musical theatre-esque, if that makes sense. So it's a performance show, a children's show, but using so we use Soundscape on that, and that was again a large, not necessarily well-behaved acoustic venue with a band and then singing on stage, as well as kind of performance and play. So yeah, we use Soundscape on that, and that was the first time that I'd used Soundscape in that manner, if you like, in a more musical fashion. And again, it offered very similar things in terms of that intimacy that you can get from a character. The thing I learnt in that show actually was the ability of how you can utilize Soundscape to do all the things we've talked about, but then actually if you break away from that suspension and you actually use the system as a normal system, how you can make an audience jump, because you get so entwined in this ability that the sound is relatively natural coming. You're aware in this arena because of the type of show it was amplified, obviously, but you're kind of so in this, and the sound is placed, that when you suddenly take something and put it through in a matrix mode and just use the sheer power of that rig to make somebody, to do something in the audience, because suddenly all of the conventions that we've set up throughout the show thus far are broken, because suddenly there's a speaker and there is a sound. And that for me was actually a really interesting moment where you go, all of those techniques are brilliant, but actually it's when you mix and match and you suddenly break that convention, how you can change how an audience interacts with that relationship with sound just for a second, and then you snap back in and they're like, what just happened? And it's another tool in that kind of arsenal of how you manipulate an audience's emotions and experience, and how you can take them from being like this, leaning in with the kind of sound here, to whoa, and then back in again. And it's quite interesting to watch. And that was also the first time I utilized it. We had a sequence which was a journey to Neverland for Peter Pan, with actor flying over the space. So it was utilizing Soundscape through the middle of the space and how that works. And there's a section where they fly through space and having planets that kind of evolved. So using it much more as an artistic tool rather than a natural reinforcement in the case of Lehman or Death of a Salesman. But yeah, having planets and instruments floating around the surround rig, which I think was the surround rig on that show. It was 18 C6s, a bit a nice old school, love a C6. But yeah, kind of all of this, and we had speakers overhead as well, so we utilized various things of how we manipulated it around the room, and so it was an artistic tool in a very different way, I guess, for us in that as well. So yeah, mix and match.
So dynamics becomes, a complete new meaning. It's not just about, the difference in level. It's also the difference in emotion that you can create with a tool
Yeah.
like that. Would you see an object-based mixing system like Soundscape as just a PA system, or is it more like a musical instrument? Is it for you? Is it the toolbox? How would you describe it? How would you describe what Soundscape does for you? This would be interesting because there's is so many different opinions and things that you can do, and I think everybody has his own take on what it is.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the word toolbox is definitely one that I would bring into the conversation. And I think having worked with it on a number of productions and performances, there's a lot of things it does and it's brilliant at them. There's a lot of things sometimes where it isn't quite the tool in that moment in that show. So you drop in and out, as I said, in and out of those conventions. But that's equally valid. So in terms of how that presents, what it does for me actually is how the system presents itself to a designer, whether that's looking at effects playback or whether that's microphone, for me is much more of a creative tool and interface rather than necessarily having to engage with some of the complex mathematics in when you're trying to. So the system setup and production sound is one thing, and the system has to be tuned correctly and all of the other things that we kind of take for granted, although there are the ability to have actually interpretation of how the system behaves through that process as well, which I personally find fascinating. But through various function groups and modes, and how the system behaves when you change those ideas. But in terms of sitting as a creative tool, I think it really does become a toolbox then, because as a designer, that ability to get things to transform through the space, you're not worried about fader offsets and all of these kind of, you're not sitting there going, let's move through that speaker and that speaker. And it becomes an exercise as a designer at that point, very much of mathematics and relationships between different speakers across the room. Whereas when you start to, I like the word paint because I like the dots remind me of painting, and you do kind of, you can start to, in the case of theatre sound design, you can start to go, well, the car travels around the room. It's a really basic example, but you can start to sculpt actually in a journey with a visual representation of that, and then listen to it and manipulate it, rather than sitting there going, waiting on sound, 10 minutes of programming faders of all of the different individual surround speakers. But then equally, and I think this is the critical thing for me, is actually the way that the system works is that ability that you're not locked to one methodology within the system. So it isn't the dot soundscape system or the matrix system. The fact that each channel has a different ability to interact with the system in a different way just gives you that toolbox of, yes, it can be a left, center, right system. If that's what we need today, it can absolutely be that. If I need a left, right system just to put a god mic through the system, it can be that. If I want to address every single speaker individually, I can. If I want to throw something around the room quickly as an artistic tool, I can. If I want to use the reverberation to change the RT time and that kind of the space, I can. And it's all relatively simple to achieve once the system is set up. And but so toolbox is definitely the right word, but it's a creative toolbox, and it's the amount of ways in which you can control it, I think, as well, which is what really opens it up using OSC. Is it might be the sound console, it might be QLab, it might be another piece of software, it might be a tracker, it might be the R1 software with a mouse and you're doing it a touch screen. There's so many different methodologies, if you like, at which creatively you can use. You can integrate it into your multi-track if you're doing a musical and you've got clicks, you can automate those things. It doesn't really matter. So toolbox is definitely the word.
it's interesting what you're saying. I mean, I'm not that much in theater plays. I'm mixing, my classical shows from time to time. I have here one in Backnang, which I'm doing since 26 years, and I'm not allowed to go. So I said, I stay. So I do what I like. This, where we tested all the previous versions from Soundscape. And what you just said is, I don't know if we can just scale it up to the work you're doing, because you're far beyond of what I'm doing. You're far away. But what I've just recognized is it takes a little bit longer, as you just said, to put the system up. It's a little bit more effort.
Yeah.
But once you have done that, a sound check to produce on the system is much more intuitive and much quicker than what you just said. If you have to just make sure that you demask, all the single signals and stuff like that, you just go for it.
Yeah, it's a slightly different skill set in some respects, but I think it's one that lends itself to a creative tool rather than necessarily a technical tool. And I think the big kind of evolution of the system, if we like, certainly in theatre terms, is that evolution of how we integrate and use control the system. And I think we've only just started. I think that's the interesting thing for me, and what I've kind of loved about working with it since early on is seeing the evolution of the control, the kind of the firmware and the software from D&B, but also those kind of the more creative, the bit that the technical I love. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to sit here and say I don't geek out over moving delay lines backwards and forwards slightly with the rounding to get them just to line up. Of course I do. That's, it's a great, but actually how you make those tools accessible to creative designers, because I think in sound design and in theatre there's a vast array. I think there's a vast array of what constitutes a sound designer. There are people who are very great content and in terms of engagement in that way. There are technical sound designers who work very much with system, and they do some sound effects, but their focus is on system. And I think in other sectors, those roles are much more defined. Whereas in theatre, you can work with 6 different people and they all bring something different and have different areas where their knowledge is better or not so good, or where they're learning. And I think the interesting thing about this, and why I think we've only just really started, is it tailors itself to if your experience is all about system, you can absolutely take control of it and do what you want with it in a minutest technical detail. If your approach to it, in terms of like the venues here at the National, if a designer comes in and their approach is much more about painting with sound, we can tailor the system in such a way that the interfaces that they're presented with enable them to manipulate what they want to hear. And all of this stuff is going on in the background with the production engineer, and that's great. But we can present them with the art version. We can present them with a touchscreen. We can present them with QLab. We can present them with other custom proprietary bits of software. And it really does depend on how that individual, their own experiences and how they want to interact, because ultimately it's about narrative. It's about, what we do in theatre is all about telling stories, and stories with sound. Sometimes that's amplification of voices for narrative. Sometimes that's how we enhance the atmosphere around that story, but it's all about storytelling and a shared experience of an audience. And so I think, it's all of those front end that enables somebody to sit there and actually just go, in my head it sounds like this, and go, I can do it. And actually the methodology of how you get there is, everyone's got a different way, but there's so many ways to work with it. And it's an interesting journey we're going on at the moment, which is how people that have never used it come into the room and go, oh, you've got Soundscape. Panic. And you go, well, we can use it as we can use the PA as a left, center, right, left, right, delay, manual delay, cross point system, if that's what you want to. There's no pressure to use Soundscape. but I can show you, or the team here, we can show you what it will do. And then they might go, oh, actually, for this one, first time, maybe you give me some dots, some effects dots in QLab, like 6 faders at the end, and I'll play around with them during the tech and start to understand how I might use this. And quite often by the end of it, they're like, yeah, next time we'll just soundscape it. But,
interesting thing, I just recently, this is where it just came from, I just finished the installation of a Soundscape, just a 180 system, a relatively small one, in the town hall of my hometown. And it's average. The technicians are average, it's all, like what you would expect in a little village. It took them 2 weeks to understand what it does, and they don't want to go back.
Yeah,
it's interesting. We just had, also the notion and the possibility to go back to whatever channel back, and even that is what we have realized over sound objects. So left hand to right is rendered onto the complete system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to broaden, the sweet spot to make stereo, accessible, for nearly everyone in the room. But what you say is an interesting one. Once you have used it, you don't want to go back. A question for me is, because I think this is always, the interesting thing is, when I started, the idea of object-based mixing, I had a club here in Stuttgart, Zapata it was called, and we just put the system in there to learn to crawl. And it was interesting. All the elderly sound engineers, they were just, no. I want to have the big fuckers left and right, and that's it. And I had an apprentice who had obviously a quite good feeling for music, but no heritage in PA systems. And I said, you do the job, you're mixing. And I have never seen anybody getting so many thumbs up when the audience left the room than him. He was just taking the thing as it is. And it's interesting, how the audience, even without recognizing what's happening, appreciates what the experience that they just had.
Completely. I mean, we were unfortunate enough, we were trying to open the Lehman Trilogy on Broadway just at the start of the pandemic. Unfortunately, I think we got to preview 4, and there was a American couple in the first interval came out, and the woman was like, I've just realized I can hear them behind glass. How, what are they recorded? There was a whole, and her husband turned around and went, it's special now, acoustically transparent glass, it's all the rage. And we were absolutely killing ourselves with laughter, because suddenly there was just this moment, and it's like, did I just hear? But yeah, transparent acoustic glass is apparently all the rage now. So, which I was very pleased with, because it was like, well, if you think the glass is transparent, you've obviously not acknowledged that the PA is doing a lot of that work. So we're all good. But yeah, it is interesting how the audience don't necessarily realize what's happening. And it's that age-old thing of sound, isn't it? Is nobody, I joke, but nobody mentions the sound unless it's bad. But it has such an impact on an individual's enjoyment of the evening, or just even the narrative. If you can't, in particular, go back to theatre, and I keep banging on about narrative, but actually, if you can't hear the words, it doesn't matter what else it looks like, whatever else we do. If you can't hear, or perceptively as an audience member, if you think you've not heard the words, because there's 2 different interpretations of thinking you have, and for me, it's just suddenly that thing when you go, they heard the words. And then she realized, and it was only in the interval, she went, they're behind glass half of the time, even when it's rotating around. So, and one of the challenges actually within that, from an audience perspective, is the glass cube revolves, and it's got glass on 2 sides, a glass pane across the middle, and various intersections. And of course, then when it's revolving, the natural acoustic field changes for the audience in real time as the narrative's happening and they're walking through the box. And so one of the great, and this was the bit where Soundscape, compared to the left and to right, really took hold, is suddenly that relationship, we could take the PA to a level where actually the relationship of the natural acoustic from the performer wasn't affected by the glass revolving in front of the audience. So we could maintain a level with the naturalism and the geographical location that the audience thought they were hearing the actor on stage acoustically, where actually, to be fair, if you mute the PA, the reality is, apart from maybe the front 2 rows, they're not. So that when the glass, of course, comes around, the relationship between the performer and the audience and the sound doesn't change. And that for me is that critical thing of the glass, is that maintaining that relationship.
And you always have the focus onto the actor, onto the one who's just, producing the words, what have you. It's an interesting thing. Going to a completely different topic right now, but it absolutely relates to what you just said. Is I call it spatial intelligibility. I have been in Strasbourg to the Hemicycle, which is the European Union Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
And we have 680 delegates. You have 2 speakers. And one is talking, and you look for 15 seconds to find, who is talking. In that time, you don't understand a word.
Yeah.
Because you're busy with something else. And what you just said, the narratives, to get the words and to have the feeling that you understand things, is you immediately have the idea from where it's coming, and then you can concentrate on what's happening. And interesting is, it is much more relaxing to listen to something like that than just to try to calculate 2 different pictures together.
Yeah, it absolutely matches up, and you suddenly go, okay. And I think it sounds ridiculous, but the audience relaxes because you suddenly go, that first line where the person speaks and you go, I can hear them from my seat, and everybody goes, we're all good, I can hear them.
Yeah, and on every seat in the theater.
And that's the critical thing, yeah.
On every seat, not with the same level, not with the same coloration, but you hear exactly the actor down there. And I think this is an interesting thing, and probably, an interesting approach to think about sound systems. When we're talking about a channel-based system, directivity, and you have to make it, as flat and as similar as possible for every seat. This is not necessary anymore. You're working with the natural acoustics. This is an interesting thing from my understanding, which is also bringing this relaxation with it. Because you don't have to concentrate. You just listen, and it's all normal, because this is what you used to hear, your entire life when you're going out on the street. When you think back, did you have many technicians, sound engineers coming across the Soundscape system, and just let me think how to phrase it. What would be your recommendation for a sound engineer who's worked for 20 years on a channel-based system and now approaching a Soundscape system? What shall this poor person do?
There's a question. I think a lot of the approaches, and I think it's through the way in which people come to it, is I've had conversations with people where you describe it. Maybe people that are listening here today, and you go, well, describe what it's doing, and you go, yeah, sure. And it's really difficult to articulate. And I, don't get me wrong, the skeptic in me, when we took it over to New York the first time, was, it was like, this is either a really ballsy move that's going to be really good, or it's the biggest fuck up I've ever made in my career. And I'm a risk, I guess I'm inherently more of a risk taker than many. But I think to somebody approaching it, you can describe it and you can say, and it's interesting because you start doing a kit list and a specification or an array calc of the space, and people that you show it to are like, what? I'm like, no, it's overlapping. And you go, you're going to have to trust me a little bit on this. And some of that is we are undoing some of those concepts that people have been ingrained with for so long. And there's an element, I think, of trust. I think listening to it suddenly, it is critical. It's that kind of thing of like, how do you describe sound? And yeah, we can talk about the natural location and the fact that it's different on different levels and how it all interacts. But until you hear what that means, and then you can, and I think also part of that is you as an engineer, it enables you to form an opinion on what it is and what it isn't. Because I think for all the things that Soundscape is, there are times where you, as I say, you just drop out of it and you go, oh, that actually, or limitations of a theatre or a rig. You know, there are certain conditions we need to meet to be able to make this work effectively. And sometimes that's not possible. But as you start to work with it, and as an engineer, you understand what those limitations are. And then you can make informed decisions about how that interacts with the audience, how that works. So there's an element of, I hate to say it, but trust me. But I think that's fine. I think, you know, take experience. And I think people sometimes do come to it and they have a listen and they go, oh, and I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve and how you, as an engineer, you work. And I think a vast number of people come up to it and go, I've been trying to do that for years with delays and, you know, matrices, and wow, great. And other people come up to it and go, I just wish it did. And some of those, and I think what's interesting is in certain styles, and I've had work with people where they've come in and said, but it doesn't quite do, and they're always usually describing something bad, but it's a product of a sound that we've, for certain bands, and it's how you, but equally then we've played around, I've worked with some people, we've played around with it, and actually you can get different variations on that slightly further forward in your face version. It's just understanding what you're trying to achieve. So I think trust is a big one. I would say actually, the ability to play, I think it's like any new tool where you approach it, is there's so many different ways of what it can and can't do, or, you know, predominantly can do, that you, how do I put it? I learn every time I use it, and there's still things I go, oh, I won't do that again. And it's usually in relation to the space, in terms of the system, might be in relation to the content. And it's evolving all the time as an idea. And, you know, it's not like I did the first show with it and we went, oh, that's that ticked, Soundscape, know how to do that, put it in the box and say you can do Soundscape. I, you know, even now, after the amount of shows we've done with it, I still come to it and go, oh, well, that, okay, yeah, that's new, okay. And it's not a fault. It's just in terms of where a speaker might be in a room or a layout and the compromises of space. And to those engineers, it's like, actually, if you play with it, you can understand what it does, how to approach it. But you have to have a slightly open mindset away from that, you know, left and right. Although, as you say, even putting a dot on the left and right and expanding the stereo field, I've seen, you know, I've seen people come to it and you go, let's just do the left and right with a dot, a virtual dot on the left and right rather than the matrix. And they suddenly go, actually, it is just wide and it is hitting me. And you go, well, maybe that's, you know, sometimes that is the middle ground, isn't it? And
absolutely. You know, my take on that one is, for those, you know, who coming, you know, with you know, decades of experience, you know, of whatever sound systems, send them out for sailing for 4 weeks, make them erase the picture they have in their head, and they have to rebuild it. Because I believe, you know, whenever you go into a show, and this is why we close the circle, in the beginning you just said that you have this play, you walk into the room, you have the PA system, and you have a picture of what you want to achieve, right?
Yeah.
And this is different to what you had 15 years ago. And I believe there must be a delete button or Control-Alt-Delete. So something like that.
It is that it's that braveness to go, and it isn't throwing away what you've forgotten, because the fundamentals of physics and all of those principles of those core principles still exist. It's just yeah, as you say, resetting and going, yeah, it doesn't quite feel right. It's like that, you know, not quite old enough, although I did experience it, is that sudden leap into line array technology from point source and go, what is this witchcraft and how it behaves? And suddenly, actually, you could suddenly go, a lot of engineers going, Christ, this is better for what we're doing in the point source we were doing before. And it suddenly becomes, oh yeah, arrays do this compared to, and then we've kind of, in theatre particularly, there was like a point of history, it's like arrays are the solution, and now we're moving gently actually ever forward back into more and more point source boxes. It's certainly in the UK theatres, which are quite, some of them are quite small, and what we're finding is actually lots and lots of point source. And as we introduce Soundscape, we're suddenly going, you know, actually we're rigging, you know, maybe 40 E5 size boxes. But actually, what's interesting with Soundscape, going back to the question about, you know, would I change the size of the speakers in the Armory? I'm probably saying not for the acoustics. In the Piccadilly, however, in under the balconies, so we had YPs on the pros in the advanced position, doing the kind of the stalls, the circle front and above. Half the stalls in that room are out of the sight of the pros. And the nervousness about going in and not having a YP on the left and right doing that shot up the stalls, and accepting that everybody underneath the overhang was basically listening to a lot of 16Cs, which we'd rotated on the front fill position, and a load of E5s and 16Cs in the delay. That was the biggest speaker pointing at all of those people with a 5-inch driver. But actually the level and depth of sound that we were creating under the balcony from those small drivers, I mean, it was a nervous leap of faith, I have to confess, but but it was that something I should have a big speaker pointing at me under here because I'm going to need something under this balcony. And it wasn't the case. And what was really interesting about that, actually, from an aesthetic point of view, is on the circle, so the balcony front in the Piccadilly hangs quite low. And we were able to put, so 16C is one of DMB's column speakers that we took to one side and did bad things to and rotated them. But what we ended up with under the balcony was a speaker that was about, I can't the exact dimensions, but it's about that deep in a row, and we had a line of them all the way across. And the sound within Soundscape, we managed to achieve a really large sound under there. But actually, from a visual imperative, people sat at the back of the stalls didn't have a chronolation of big speakers dropped down in front of their view, which would have impeded their ability to see the actors in the box, which would have kind of gone back to defeating the first point, which is it's all about actors and the narrative. So, yeah, it's interesting.
It's an interesting one, and I can tell you, our friends in Sweden, you know, have just taken the idea with the 16C and rotated horn, and they use it all the time because, you know, it's such a slim, you know, neat little, you know, solution where you just put this row together, and they really love it. Absolutely clear. Dom, if you would, you know, have the task to tell a youngster, you know, how to approach, you know, object-based mixing, what would you tell him?
Yeah, that's, how would I say? I would say trust, and this is going to sound like a very bizarre thing, trust your ears. And in terms of your approach to it is, don't necessarily be drawn in to preconceptions that you might have about how sound works. I think we've all been, you know, exposed. You go to concert, or you go to a fete at a thing, and sound is 2 speakers on a stick, you know, in the village fete. And there might be a band that plays in the evening, and we all have a great time, and it's amazing, and you know. But your experiences form from that. So there's how do I put it? There's a kind of experience, I think, that we all have, whether that's with headphones and stuff as well, which is sound has a certain level of maybe distortion and kind of unclean things into it, and that forms part of our opinion on what sound is. And actually, as you approach object-based, you start to remove a lot of those barriers. And I think it's that thing about looking up and basically engaging your ears with the visual. And I think that for me is what soundscape and object-based mixing is instead of looking at the mixer and looking at the meters and looking at the dials, if you actually, it sounds really cliche, but if you just lift your head up and look, and is what you're hearing match what you're seeing? Because actually that relationship of an engineer, if you go, the image is now relation to what my eyes are seeing, the brain has to do a lot less work to unpick, and suddenly you do relax and you go, yeah, look, I'm looking up, and suddenly I think the ability to mix in that becomes much clearer, because you look up and you go, what is it? And you go, I can't, and you go, it's the guitarist is playing, and his fader's not up. But by looking up, you look up and you go, there's a guitarist there, but I can't. But because you've got that thing of all the images placed around and how the sound is interacting with the stage in the auditorium, it gives you that ability just to lift your head up and actually link the two together, I think, which is what the audience are doing in that moment, whether they're conscious of it or not. And I think as an engineer, actually, that's the thing, is lift your head up and look. And the same is true in theatre. It's very easy to get buried down inside the mixer or inside the software, and we're all guilty of it. I'm terribly guilty of it. And you sit there and you suddenly at the end of the tech lift your head up and you go, oh, when did they move that on stage? And everyone was like, oh, 3 days ago. And you're like, and I think that's what object-based does. It gives you that ability to just lift your head up and start to relate the aural with the visual in a way that's different. And as a young engineer coming into it, or somebody coming into the industry, it gives you that ability to kind of manipulate the audience. That sounds bad, but it enables you to take them on a journey. Yeah.
It's an interesting quote what you just said. I think I can completely underline that. Is be open-minded. Don't think about the technology. This is just this little aid that you need, this tool to make that happen. Have a listen. This is what it's all about.
Yeah, I think we're all too. I think sometimes there's I think sound historically is an interest. I think sound has historically always been approached from, this is how you put together a sound system, and then we'll work out what to do with it. Whereas I think in object, you start to go down this world of going, how do we want this to be? And then you can start to approach it the other way, is how do we achieve it with the system? But let's work out how we want this to sound. And I think, in education particularly, and you get taught, lighting get taught to imagine emotion and look at a picture and how does this feel, or read the script and how does this emotively, and how would you light it, and or it's sunset, and the relationship, where sound is, there's a sound desk, make it work. And then we kind of at some point come to the point of going, well, what are the audience actually feeling in relation to sound? And I think this is that moment when you go, actually, how do we want the audience to interact with sound? And then we can go and work out the rig. And I think that's one of the big changes in it for me, is you're looking at it the other way.
But this is my unfunded theory. The idea that a loudspeaker is always bad and disturbing, it comes solely from, it is completely disconnected from the stage once it's rigged left and right. Yeah, it has nothing to do with the design or with the beauty of a loudspeaker, because have you ever seen a beautiful lamp?
That's true.
but they are directly connected and related to the theater, to the stage, to what's happening there. And with Soundscape, we do now exactly the same. The speakers, they are part of the show. They are not disconnected left and right. They are really part of the play. And I believe in the long run, we will all see and understand that the acceptance of loudspeakers in the room will be increased dramatically, because with the things that we can do and the emotions that we can produce with a system like that.
Yeah, and I think there's there are directors that go, I don't like radio mics, I don't like what they do. And actually, bringing one of those directors into one of these shows, and actually, well, actually, I'd probably say so. Marion Elliott, who directed Death of a Salesman, came and saw Lehman, and contacted me on the back of it and said, whatever witchcraft was on Lehman, I want it, because Death of a Salesman was following it in, and she went, whatever the witchcraft is, I want it, because she's like, it was radio mic'd and I didn't feel it was radio mic'd, but evidently it was, because they're behind glass, so whatever it is. And that was just a director that came to watch a show, who, you know, isn't a massive fan on radio mics and performance, for all the reasons where it breaks those lines of narrative and communication with speakers. And she watched the show, and it was, like I said, it was quite a nice moment of just receiving an email saying, actually, whatever that is, I don't know. The technology, and to be fair, it's not the conversation of what the technology is, frankly. You know, no. It doesn't matter. It was more the fact that she said it was radio. You know, she came and observed it, and it was fully, obviously radio mic'd, because of all the glass and all the other things. But she went, I want that for my show. So it is that, yeah, exactly that. It's that acceptance of loudspeakers. And when I think the loudspeakers enable people that, and it's not necessarily about not understanding sound, but it's about the kind of how the brain and how they emotionally react to sound as a director. And if you suddenly start to go, actually, we can do that thing where we can start to invisibly mic them, but now look at what you can do with sound over the top of that creatively, because we can make it sound like you're hearing them. But look at all of the depth of tone and all these kind of creative ideas that we can layer around voices. Whereas before, you could do a certain amount, but then it would either be the game relationship between the sound effect and the actor would change, and you'd be like, oh, it's too loud, pull it back. So sound designer, then you're fighting the noise floor, engaging things like projecting, moving lights and stuff, fans in units, so the noise floor of the theatre's higher, then the mics, and you're fighting it up. And actually, and don't get me wrong, Soundscape doesn't solve fan noise. So anyone that's watching it going, Soundscape solves fan noise, it really doesn't. But I think what it enables you to do is maintain that relationship with the performer up to here, and actually increases the dynamic range of which a sound designer can work creatively around that space. And because of the way in which the sound field works within the surrounds and stuff and delay lines, we can geographically place objects within that world and paint that picture, but it hasn't suddenly got to be a massive loudspeaker over there that now is too loud for the audience that are sat close to it, and the people over there barely hear it. And you go, well, that isn't going to work. Whereas by using the whole rig with relative delay and stuff, you can actually go, yeah, that totally can do that. And everybody on every level has a similar, not the same, but a similar experience, or can hear it, across all of the levels in all of the different locations.
Get the narrative, as you just said in the beginning, the important bit, yeah. And it doesn't have to be, exactly the same frequency response, but you have to get the narrative. You have to understand the words. You have to get the idea of the theater play. And I believe, this object-based thing, in our case, Soundscape, is absolutely the way to achieve that. Dom, we could go on forever, I believe, huh?
We probably could, yeah.
I think it was a quite interesting, talk and insights, about your work. What are the next shows that you're working on? Is there anything that we should see?
Well, I say harp on about it. So in September, all COVID being well, we're going back out to Broadway to finally open Lehman on Broadway. That's the next kind of sound design thing. And then I've got some Christmas shows in the pipeline as well. And then a secret show that I can't talk about just yet that may be happening next year, which is quite exciting down in Cornwall. If it does, we'll see.
Cool. Hey, what should I say, Dom? Thank you very much, for the time and the insights that you have given us. I believe, if you are a little bit related to sound, you should understand, and you should give it at least a try. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was it right now about the FAQs that we have after this session right now. We will be there live, and we will answer those questions from the folks that will be drawn in. Other than that, I have to say, Dom, thank you very much. Interesting thing. Absolutely fantastic.
No, thank you for having me. It's been great conversation.
Also, we should continue that once, with a proper pint.
Oh, for the time when we can continue this with a proper pint and a soon, hopefully soon.
Yeah, it will happen. It will happen. They can't lock it down forever. So
No.
I'm looking forward to that. In fall, I believe in autumn we will get together, and then we have this very pint. Dom, thank you very much. In that case, I wish you a splendid weekend, splendid week, and I hope we see ourselves soon again. We will be still there to answer your questions.
Yeah.
And other than that, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Very good. Thank you for thank you for joining us, everyone. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat or any burning questions.
Yeah, we can't wait to answer your questions. It doesn't matter how silly or how simple they are. Just drop them in. I think we all are interested in your thoughts, in your opinions.
I think it feels like a long time ago that we recorded that now.
It probably is, huh? We talked about autumn.
I was just listening at the end there going, oh, September.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, yeah. Yes, I can, Sarah, of course. So Sarah just asked me to talk a little bit about some of the shows. So we ended up in September. We did actually go back, and Lehman completed successfully its 3-month run on Broadway. So we went back out with all the COVID regulations. It was a very bizarre experience flying back out into New York because at that point we had to have COVID visa exemptions. So there was a very small amount of shows and a very small amount of people. So New York was a very different place to experience. But yes, we went out and we opened it, and we managed to complete the entire run up until January the 4th without losing a single show due to COVID. What was interesting, actually, is probably relevant to the discussion we've just had, is that actually going back out there and listening is made quite substantial changes to the system, having had some time away from it, and suddenly going back in. And I talked previously about that kind of experience of constantly learning, and it was interesting having been forced away from the project for a while, and then going back in and listening and going, oh, we would change that, and so suddenly changing some of it with speaker positions. We added some components to the rig, including my much favored now circle front fill, which was a product of the overhang in the theatre. So it was quite interesting going back to it. And then subsequently, since that, I've been doing a number of online shows, actually, which are less relevant to Soundscape in this discussion. Because again, as theatre's kind of reopening slowly but surely, as we hopefully move into a post-COVID world. So Yeah, and then the next thing on that front at the moment is at the end of February, beginning of March, Lehman moves over to Los Angeles. So we've got that to look forward to. Currently designing the system for that.
Where in Los Angeles, Dom?
It's at the I have to put my teeth back in. The Halmanson Theatre over in Los Angeles. So we're just currently building a system design for that to load in and looking at the challenges that will bring, and how we start to look at how we tour a sound system rig, because that's the next challenge, if you like, which is an exciting challenge, but working within the confines of the different architecture of different theatres, and designing a system that is cost effective, obviously to a budget, but then is flexible enough to work in those multiple different venues with the different challenges of different throw distances to balconies, different numbers of balconies, different depths of delay lines, and achieving that in a timely manner on a load-in. So that's the current challenge.
Yeah, as we spoke during our session, Dom, don't be afraid of smaller speakers. Instead of using the big stuff, and be more flexible by using smaller speakers. I think this is one of the ideas, one of the solutions to make a thing like that tourable. Right? You have to be flexible. You have to change vertical angle. You have to be able to arrange the speakers accordingly to the room and the seating situation. And the smaller they are, the easier it is.
Yeah, completely. And it's about, I mean, one of the big things in theatre as well is obviously weight loadings and stuff, and looking at how you design something that, and it's great, relatively speaking, for the power output, a lot of the speakers are quite light, but obviously there is still a point in some of those larger venues where, and as you say, smaller speakers, can be the solution to that, with the flexibility, within the system. Yeah. Incidentally, Ralf, what have you been up to with Soundscape recently? Is there some projects that you've been working on?
There's one thing that I just worked on together with the Ensemble Modern in Frankfurt. It's a good old friend of mine, Norbert Ommer, who is the toolmaster of that ensemble, and we were planning to do a bird whistle earth dances show in the radio station for Frankfurt. But this was now cancelled because the Frankfurt radio station just claimed itself be system relevant, and they don't want to let anybody else in their premises anymore. So we canceled that one.
Oh,
and there's another show I'm working on, which is happening in August in Bregenz, not on the lake stage, but on a smaller stage within the same premises, which is a quite experimental musical dance piece with a composer called Brigitta Mundendorf. And it's a little bit of a strange topic. It's a melancholia. It's a painting from Albrecht Dürer, and they try to interpret it with dance and music.
Okay.
Yeah. And she's quite interesting, this composer, Brigitta Mundendorf. She did another dance show, The Archipel, where she's obviously, just try to visualize with music and dance again the movement from the human man, or the mankind after, whatever disruptive change, and then the development of the new human mankind and society. Interesting stuff for 2 hours. And I sat there and I was just like, you can do that. And it was a center stage situation as well. And again, we used small speakers. And the difference was, which is probably quite interesting, when this is Archipel is a center stage, it's like an island in the middle of the room. And when we talked about speaker placement, we said, no, we can't fly anything there because there are no wicking points. We are in the center of the horn and all this stuff. And then we decided, why don't we see this island as a musical instrument itself?
Mm-hmm.
So we placed all speakers underneath the thing and have them firing upwards. And all of a sudden, the architecture, the musicians, and the dance melted together as one thing. And it came out of this archipelago. And then we used surrounds to create the right environment. There was a choir flying around and strange noises. Don't stop thinking. Creativity doesn't stop here. This is just interesting. You just, throw overboard everything you know about sound and just think, what can I possibly do to make that amazing?
No, completely. I mean, since we recorded that video, we've actually completed our second Soundscape install here at the National Theatre as well. So we've got it installed in 2 of the venues. So we've got it in the Littleton and the Dorfman now, which are one's kind of a Pros Arts theatre and the other is a studio theatre. And it's been interesting seeing sound designers coming in, I say post-pandemic, but this return to work and engaging with those systems, particularly in the Dorfman, which is the theatre we reopened sooner. And just looking similar to your experience there with the circular stage, the Dorfman frequently has performance spaces that are not necessarily end on or would be traditionally quite easy to work with. And so we've had designers coming in, some of whom working with us for the first time and experiencing this system. And with that kind of, as previously discussed, that kind of trepidation, but actually we've been sat down, and Sarah Weltman, who's the sound and video supervisor down there, working alongside these designers and showing them, that kind of hybrid working. And we've been using the on scene element of it to subtly reinforce radio mics up to balconies and stuff. So that kind of same thing emanating out, but then using the loudspeaker rig as part of a creative tool for sound moving around the room. So it's been interesting actually, in that watching that journey of people, as you say, being creative and suddenly going, and what was interesting about one of the shows actually that came was a show that pre-existed elsewhere and had already been programmed in I'd say more traditional fashion, if you like, using faders within QLab. And actually coming in here was removing multiple sends in those faders and being able to manipulate sound in that space, and that kind of freedom of just moving a dot to get a sound to go in a circle around a room, which sounds really obvious. But compared to 12 faders and different speakers and stuff. And it's been a really interesting journey with the team here, kind of engaging with that and the designers as well. And we look forward to seeing where that goes in the future. Yeah.
How long will it take that this idea of reproducing music becoming mainstream?
It's a good question.
I can't answer it, but I think it's a pretty, let's say, charming idea that all of a sudden we are experience and interacting with music and musicians in a different way. And if Soundscape was just the key to open this door a little bit, I'm proud.
No, it's definitely there on the way with it. I think it's a really interesting tool, and like I say, the developments and what I mean, the big thing actually for us, it probably is worth saying, is when we went out to New York, is that we had the new firmware revisions and stuff. So some of the things that we had been attempting before, and obviously in discussion with you guys and finding, I'd say, workarounds for in releases, suddenly going back out to New York and having a release that achieved a number of those, so level to function group and stuff suddenly in the software, meant that we could achieve things that we had not previously been able, or finding ways around.
Sounds up and down.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about vertical. But yes, it does open up the possibilities of sound.
It does open up plenty of possibilities. I'm just experimenting with that function as well. And even if it's just a few faders you see in the user interface, all of a sudden, if you think it's I can probably achieve that if I'm doing that and do a little bit of OSC programming, and all of a sudden I can interact. With it's interesting. It's interesting. Yeah, it's a pretty good function that is built in there.
Yeah, and it's a kind of, I wouldn't say it's an accidental function of it, but suddenly once you realize what that does unlock, it solves a number of other, I would say problems, but kind of creative challenges with different layouts and compromises that you might encounter with the system. But yeah, suddenly unlocking the possibility of a Z is, yeah, it's almost like somebody needs to write some software to control that, isn't it?
Feel free. It's always free. Everybody
Well,
can, take a little smile and put something together. I mean, it's also, always this notion we need to set axis. I mean, for me, there's still, a little bit of a misunderstanding what the set axis can do for you. For me, it's more like, manifesting sound above you, but can you determine the height of the object? Probably not. Your ears are in that plane. What's happening here and there is more or less frequency depending. And I remember doing a show with Serge and Kraftwerk, and we had our 360 system far too high. And there's a German professor called Professor Blauert, and he made a little graph of what frequency is predominantly responsible for what orientation of sound, or for what orientation. And there's one frequency which is just responsible for overhead orientation. This is 8 kilohertz. 8 kilohertz, a third octave wide, not much. Just one frequency. And you have to try it. If you have delays, overhead delays, just push down 8 kilohertz by 3 dB, 4 dB. You don't lose much information, but the speakers disappear. They are not there anymore. And what we did there is, we just had them far too high, so we just pulled out this 8 kilohertz, and all of a sudden the rig was there. And even I, that knew what I've done, during the half of the show, I said, "Oh, fuck, they are there." No, it's you're
all from 8
losing
kilohertz.
the overhead orientation completely, and I believe you can probably move it the other way in as well. If you have just a couple of speakers and you have them a little bit too high, and you put 8K in, you make them more sounding coming from above, and you pull the 8K out, and it's tripping down again. Try it. It's
I'm going to
interesting.
try it.
And it's cheap because you just need one frequency band to play around.
There's a place on the market there for that box, the 8 kilohertz cut box.
It's 1
I'm
kilohertz.
going to go home and market it now. It's the Z-axis box. We can make a killing.
It's an interesting one. Yeah, but stuff like that can be solved, with a little bit of creativity. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Very good. I think if no one's got any questions,
Which is a little. We were too good. We did tell too much.
We told too much. Yeah. No, we did tell too much. But yeah, if after this, anyone, I'm on the Facebook group. So if anybody does suddenly go, "Oh, I wish that," feel free to drop a message on the Facebook live stream, and I will answer subsequently. That's fine. Yeah.
I will do that too for a little bit more time. Usually I'm not on Facebook, but especially today just for you gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I will spend some time in Facebook to answer your questions if you like.
Very good. I think we're all going to run away and try the 8K trick. Robin's certainly going to go and do it. I think we're all off to do it now.
The thing that you have to do, I've given you at least a perspective and a task.
Yeah, and just need to go away and write some software that now incorporates a Z-axis. I'll have to talk to a colleague of mine.
Yeah, you can easily program it in QLabs, and you can move things, through the different rings. Not that dramatic.
Very good.
All right, Dominic, as usual, a pleasure.
Likewise with yourself, sir.
Yeah, and we still haven't got the chance to have the pint together.
No, I did realize that after we were.
But it will happen. It will happen. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you everyone for joining us.